You are tuned in to Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I am your host, Jack Johnson. Follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. The Royals almost had history last night from a very unlikely hero in Dairon Blanco, so we'll get into that in our first segment. Secondly, Scott Barlow wasn't good last night, so how much longer should the Royals wait to trade him? And lastly, I was a little bit concerned about Daniel Lynch's velocity last night. Is that just who he is now? Or is he a guy that eventually can ramp it up? Maybe just have to wait to the offseason. All that is coming up next on Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Things first, we want to thank you for making Locked On Royals your first listen every day. And you can check us out on all those podcasting platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. You also can check us out on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. You can also message me or ask me any questions on Twitter by tweeting at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And we want to give a shout out to today's title sponsor in Sleeper. I'm going to have some fun picks for you here coming up in about 10 to 15 minutes. Believe I was right on one of my two picks that I made earlier in the week. I think I had Jordan Lyles going more than 5 innings, or at least 5.5 innings. He went 6 shutout innings against the Tigers on Monday night. So one of my predictions at least was right. I think I also had Nick Prado homering. That ended up being incorrect. But if you want to take my advice with some fantasy baseball, I'm always happy to give it to you on Sleeper. To kick off the show today, I feel like it's a necessity that we have to talk about the headliner last night in Dairon Blanco, a 30-year-old rookie, nearly becoming the first Royal in almost 33 years to hit for the cycle. And I think that's what makes baseball beautiful, is that you never really can predict what is going to happen, who's going to break your record, who's going to throw the perfect game, who's going to hit the walk-off home run, who's going to chase for a batting title. Like Luis Arraez right now is chasing for a batting title in Miami. I know he was up there last year, but before 2 years ago, I don't think anybody would have envisioned Luis Arraez being at that spot. But that's what makes baseball great, is that you can truly never predict what's going to happen. Sometimes you have a Cy Young candidate go out on the bump and he gets shelled by a team that's 40 games under 500. It just can happen that way. It's a long season. It's 162 games. You're bound for excitement like that. And last night, I think, was the most invested I've been into an individual performance for the Royals since Jorge Lopez's near no-hitter in Minnesota back in 2018. That, to me, was the last time that I forgot about everything for the rest of the season and directly focused on one guy. And that is odd for me to do when you're covering this team, when you're watching this team, and you want to have multiple guys you're looking to and saying, well, I want Bobby Witt Jr. to play well. I want Nick Prado, Michael Garcia to play well. I want MJ Melendez to play well. But last night, I kind of got caught up in all of it, forgot about those players, and directly focused on a guy that may or may not be in the big leagues next year. But that's not what I'm going to get out here. I'm not going to have too much negativity in this opening segment. So Dairon Blanco played in 5 games last year. Right? He's only been known for his speed. If you don't really know where Dairon Blanco came from, he was in that Jake Diekman trade back in 2019. The Royals had Diekman for about 30, 35 innings as half a season, and they flip him to Oakland, who then goes on to make the postseason that year. But the Royals get in return, I believe it was Kevin Merrill, who was a middle infielder, good speed, bad contact, or bad power, bad walk rate, never really made it or amounted to much in Kansas City. Then you got Dairon Blanco. And Dairon Blanco was more so of the eye popper in that deal because of his 80 grade speed. He had this lightning quick speed, great contact, and he was more of an age prospect because he defected from Cuba. So he's 26, 27 at the time, and he doesn't get to Kansas City until he's 29. And this year, he turns 30, and he does what few players in Kansas City have ever done, or comes close to doing what few players in Kansas City have ever done. And Dairon Blanco begins the night by roping a triple into the gap, uses his speed. It was a bad play by Eric Haas out there in left field, kind of like MJ Melendez in left. They're putting a catcher out there. Never really works to your advantage. But he has an RBI triple. Then he gets this bunt single later on in the game, drives in another run. Then he gets this double that squeaks by third base, diving play. It actually stops before even hitting the wall. So it wasn't hit that hard. But in my mind, I think the wheels start spinning a little bit, and I think he's really got a chance at a cycle. But I thought to myself, the only way Dairon Blanco gets a cycle is if somebody dives in the outfield, he misses, it's an inside the park home run. There's no way that Dairon Blanco is going to hit one out of the stadium to complete the cycle. And by the way, that's the most exciting way to complete the cycle. Some people will tell you triple because it's the hardest to get, and I do believe that. But I always believe the last thing to get that's the most exciting is a home run because you really can soak it in, right? I think if you go up to the plate and people are paying attention, they're going, all he needs is a home run. He hits a home run, everybody can celebrate for longer than maybe you can on just a single or a triple. I know Elly De La Cruz had a very electrifying triple to complete the cycle about a couple weeks ago. But Dairon Blanco is not Elly De La Cruz. Dairon Blanco is a 30-year-old rookie, 27 games to his name at the big league level. He was hitting 188 coming into the night. He's hitting ninth, by the way. Ninth in the lineup, hitting 188. And yet here he comes up in the bottom of the eighth inning. And I'm just hoping the guy gets on, right? I'm just hoping that he has a 4-for-4 night, a 3-for-3 with a walk, something like that. And he doesn't waste any time. I mean, it's a hanging breaking ball, and he just clubs it to left center field. And I thought off the bat it was going into the fountains. That's how hard he seemingly hit it. And as the ball's carrying, I'm thinking to myself, would this be the most improbable historic feat in Royals history? And I mean individual historic feat. Like I think Jorge Lopez, who I just mentioned, would have had the most historic feat in Royals history, individual performances. I know you could say, George Brett's MVP. I get it, but George Brett's a Hall of Famer. Jorge Lopez was I don't want to say a bargain bin guy. He was still a prospect for Milwaukee when the Royals traded Moustakas for him. But he was nearly on the verge of a perfect game. How limited those have been in Major League Baseball. And Jorge Lopez, who was never good for the Royals, nearly threw a perfect game. Like that, to me, would have been the most improbable thing that's ever happened in Royals history, individual-wise. Then it probably would have been this. Dairon Blanco, a 30-year-old rookie, nearly hitting for the cycle. So George Brett hit for the cycle, his second time, I believe, July 25th, 1990, against Toronto. So next Wednesday, it'll be 33 years to the date. And the fact the Royals have gone this long between cycles, or almost cycles, if you will, and the guy that could have broken it was a 30-year-old rookie, that's what makes baseball special. That's what makes years like this from time to time special. We always want to bring up the doom and gloom. We want to bring up the negativity for a bad baseball team. At least what I've loved for a team that's 28-68 is that guys are getting a chance to play at the big league level that never were going to. No, and maybe you take that as a bad thing, but I've enjoyed seeing a 28-year-old rookie in Freddie Fermin be one of the team's best hitters and a above average league hitter. Or above league average hitter. I know I mixed up my words there. Dairon Blanco would not be on many big league teams. Maybe Freddie Fermin wouldn't either. Now, you're seeing them perform well, so maybe a team would put them at their big league level. But maybe they never would have gotten a shot because of their age, because of their position. And last night, that was really cool to me. That was really awesome to see a guy that may or may not be in the big leagues next year. But to have a moment like that, he can always say that he came within inches of a cycle. And I still think that's close enough to history where it's worth mentioning. I'm pretty sure he's going to be in the lineup later on tonight. There'll be game 3 of a 4-game set against Detroit. Ryan Yarbrough gets the ball for the Royals. It'll be Eduardo Rodriguez getting the ball for the Tigers. I hope he's in the lineup tonight. I hope that Matt Quatrero can milk this out a little bit. The guy's hot. He was great in the minor leagues this year. Had one of the best triple slashes down there in Omaha. and he had a ton of stolen bases. There's still value to him. But I think when you have a guy that's worked his tail off for his entire career, spent a lot of time in the minor leagues, and then he almost does this, that's what's great about baseball. And that was, to me, one of, if not the highlight of the 2023 season. Maybe it seems a bit overzealous, or I'm being too dramatic about a guy that didn't even break, the record, didn't have history. But I think the unlikelihood there, being a 30-year-old rookie, having only 27 games under your belt, that's cool to me. That is really a remarkable feat of what he did last night. And his average skyrocketed, I think, from 188 to 250. So he still got that minimum amount of at-bats where a good night can fluctuate his average a lot. Now, I know it's not the only thing we look at there, but good for Dairon Blanco. Good for the Royals that hung on to an 11-10 win last night. Scott Barlow nearly coughed up the game in the ninth by giving up 4 runs. And that's who we're going to talk about next. So, how much longer should the Royals wait to trade Scott Barlow? We'll talk about that coming up on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I am your host, Jack Johnson. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. Before we go any further, let's give a shout out to one of our sponsors in Dave. Finances can be so intimidating. That's why you need Dave. Dave can make managing your money so much easier with an interest-free extra cash advance, fee-free goal tracking, and easy ways to find a side hustle to make more money. Dave is the banking app that's leveling the financial playing field. When you download Dave, you get up to $500 in 5 minutes or less. No credit check, no late fees. It's a part of Dave's extra cash account. Advance the money you need with no interest, and then settle up later. Download Dave today at dave.com/MLB. That's dave.com/MLB. You can get up to $500 in 5 minutes or less, no credit check, no late fees. Download the Dave app now or go to dave.com/MLB. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Eligibility criteria and instant transfer fees apply. Banking services provided by Evolve, member FDIC. As I'm watching Dairon Blanco nearly hit for the cycle last night, I'm just trying to enjoy the moment and hopefully set it up to talk about a Royals win today. That's all that was going through my mind. And as the Royals add a couple more runs in the bottom of the 8th, I think this should be easy. Scott Barlow's pitched once in the last 4 days. It should be pretty easy for him to come into this spot and just get 3 outs, move on, and hopefully you can at least claim a series split at minimum tonight. But Scott Barlow goes into the game and just doesn't happen. Right, he gives up a hit early on to the leadoff batter, has a wild pitch, then gives up a walk, then there's another hit. A lot of soft contact, but the command wasn't there. And no, I don't think a bad outing, a bad night for Scott Barlow is going to dictate everything. It's not going to ruin his trade chances. There's not going to be a contender that says, well, that's one bad outing, we no longer want him. That's like the Taylor Clark situation, where Taylor Clark originally has had a bad outing. And I said, well, it doesn't mean everything. If a team still wants him, an owner, a GM, a president of baseball operations still wants Taylor Clark, well, then they can go for him still. They're not going to be too caught up in a bad outing. And Scott Barlow had been really good up until last night. But I'm not willing to take a chance on a bad stretch for Scott Barlow. ERA is not everything. His ERA is near 5 now. But his FIP is the best it's been since 2021, which was a really good year for Scott Barlow. And his strikeout numbers are still pretty good. The velo's down a bit, which concerns me. But I've already talked myself into the fact that I don't think the Royals are going to get a big-time return for Scott Barlow. I think it's going to be maybe less than what they got for Aroldis Chapman. You're just hoping for a couple of throw-ins. But to me, I don't think there's, I guess, a positive outlook in hanging on to him a bit longer. Right? We're inching closer and closer to the deadline. I know a lot of those deals happen on the day of the deadline. But if there's a team calling now, and you don't think it's going to get much better, if you don't think somebody's going to come busting down your door and blow your socks off with a type of deal with a top 30 prospect or a couple of top 30s, then I'd act on this. Because I don't think anybody's going to come busting down the door. And it also leaves up the chance that Scott Barlow has a bad week here. And then that could scare off a couple of teams that were offering you good prospects in return. That would be my biggest concern for him. And last night, the Royals still won the game, but Scott Barlow pitched maybe the worst he had all season long. Velo was way down, didn't have any snap, any bite to that curveball / slider. Fastball wasn't really being located through a ton of pitches. And let's keep in mind here, too, the Detroit Tigers have a terrible offense. He was not going through Atlanta's lineup. He was not going through Tampa's lineup. He wasn't going through the Yankees lineup, who you'll see over the weekend, or Boston's lineup, or Baltimore's lineup, or Toronto's. Is a bad lineup he was facing. And he still struggled a lot. And if the Royals would have blown that game, it just would have been another one you could throw in there for the bullpen screwing things up. The bullpen last night, I believe, gave up 5 runs after Daniel Lynch, who we'll talk about here shortly, gave up 5 runs as well. This bullpen is just a disaster. And I think what you can do at this point is at least try to capitalize maybe a little bit before the deadline and moving Scott Barlow. Maybe you wanted to go out there one more time and maybe fix some things, look really good in New York or something like that. That's a possibility. What if you go to New York and Scott Barlow picks up a save or 2? You leave him there. You leave him in New York, you make a deal, you make a trade there. It would be weird to see Scott Barlow back with short hair and no facial hair. But if you can get a good prospect or 2 for Scott Barlow, it's something you have to act on. Right? And I'm okay now if the return is very similar to Aroldis Chapman, because I like the 2 guys that they got in return. I like Reagans. I like Ronny Cabrera. I don't think Scott Barlow could generate as much of a buzz as Aroldis Chapman did, but maybe you can put a sweetener in that deal. Maybe you can put a sweetener with Carlos Hernandez. Maybe you throw in a sweetener like a Nick Lofton, because your infield is pretty much set over there on the left side with Bobby Witt Jr. and Maikel Garcia. There are a lot of possibilities you can go with to get bigger returns at the deadline. I think that's what a lot of Royals fans are wondering about going into this deadline. What can we get in return? And is it really going to be significant to our rebuild? If it's not significant to our rebuild, then maybe it's not worth making that trade. Now, Scott Barlow is a guy that's going to be traded. He's still got, I believe, another year of control. So that does make it more enticing at times, maybe to some teams, than Aroldis Chapman. He's younger than Aroldis Chapman. He doesn't cost much. I know Aroldis Chapman doesn't cost much, but he's going to be a free agent again at the end of the year. Scott Barlow is not. And when you have a guy that has club control, it only adds the value, which is why Scott Barlow would have been a great trade chip going back 2-3 years ago when the Royals were still losing 100 games, 95 games. They weren't contending, but the Royals wanted to hang on to him. And in the end, it's turned out that his value has maybe never been lower, right? His value might be the lowest that it's been since 2018, which was his rookie season. But again, that was the chance they took. That was the gamble they took. And now it's about acting on the right time. When a team comes calling for Scott Barlow, I don't think you have the upper hand or you have the leverage to say, well, we're going to hang on to him just a little bit longer. We're going to wait till the day of the deadline where a team comes busting down our door and says, fine, we're going to give you X, Y, and Z. No, you were holding out for us for a long time. I'm sure the Royals are going to play the typical game of we've got a lot of teams calling for him. If you call us back early, we'll give you Scott Barlow for a couple more prospects. Or maybe we like the original deal. Now we want to add an extra prospect in that deal. That's how those negotiations, I feel like, are going for Kansas City, that J.J. McCall is waiting this out longer and longer and longer, and he wants to save at least a couple of trade chips until the deadline. Now, Aroldis Chapman was always the gimme, right? He was the prize piece. They didn't want him to get hurt. I don't think Scott Barlow's at risk or concern of being hurt. It always can happen in baseball. That's why I don't want to really jinx it. But that can happen in baseball. You never really can say, well, we're worried about him getting hurt. It can happen to anybody in baseball. You can throw a pitch, you can swing wrong, you can dive, you can be running on the bases. Injuries happen not only in baseball, they happen in sports. So you can't use that as a backdrop. You can't use that as a fallback. And I think that Scott Barlow is a guy that even with his velo is down, it's not because of injury or arm fatigue. He hasn't been used that much this year. He was running to the ground under Mike Matheny. I think Matt Quatrero is handling the situation a little bit differently, and we saw that in game 1 against Detroit. They could have brought in Scott Barlow for a 4-out save, and instead they go to Jose Cuas, who blew the game. And in the end, maybe that's the better thing than throwing Scott Barlow out, running himself into the ground, having nights like last night, and the trade value just simply dissolves. But I wouldn't wait any longer. I'm not waiting any longer on Scott Barlow. If there is an offer out there, I think I'm going to act on it because I don't want to take a chance that he has a Taylor Clark stretch here. And the numbers don't look as good and the return won't be as high. Before we wrap up our show, the guy who was on the bump last night to begin the game, Daniel Lynch, did not look very good, though we've seen starts like this before. But I'm not overly concerned about the earned runs. I'm not overly concerned about the walks, the hits. I'm concerned about the velo. And I'll tell you about it next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. Before we talk some Daniel Lynch and his velocity from last night, let's give a shout out to one of our sponsors and our title sponsor in Sleeper. I'm going to take this Red Sox offense to score more than 5.5 runs off Ken Waldichuk for the Oakland A's. Waldichuk has an ERA north of 6.6. Feel like Boston, who has been surging of late, can really have a good power night against him. I think they'll leave the yard a couple of times, and I think they'll be able to get to Ken Waldichuk early. So those are my 2 picks for Sleeper. Now, with Sleeper, or do you want to win 100 times your money on daily fantasy baseball? Sleeper is now offering up to 100 times the payout for up to 8-pick contests. Choose as many as 8 players that you like and pick more or less on your favorite baseball stats like home runs, strikeouts, hits, and more. Get your picks right, and you could win big with Sleeper. So those are my 2 Sleeper picks. If you love daily fantasy baseball, this is the app that you need to use in Sleeper. They are today's title sponsor. Daniel Lynch has been one of those guys to me that always, and I don't think I'll ever back down on this because I'm going to die on this hill, it feels like. I always thought Daniel Lynch had the biggest upside of anybody in that 2018 draft class. You know, he felt like coming out of Virginia. He's a tall, lanky lefty, interesting arm slot. Velo, I thought, in college was going to translate over to the big league level. I remember early on when he was pitching in the Arizona Fall League. I mean, he's touching 98, 99. Now, the gun's usually hot down there in Arizona, so it was more likely 94, 95, 96. And then when he broke into Kansas City early on, he was sitting around that range. About 94, about 95, about 96. And last night, I think we're seeing a Daniel Lynch that has completely changed his approach and becoming a pitch-to-contact guy. And he's sitting 89 to 91. And he's 6'6", 205, 210 pounds. And he's throwing it pretty soft in there. And I don't think his curveball and I don't think his slider and I don't think his changeup have good enough rotation to it to be a pitch-to-contact guy. And I think if you're sitting that low with your velocity, what you need is a good fastball spin rate. He doesn't have that. I think he's been better with command. I think from time to time he's limited hard contact, but it's more so hoping and praying, it looks like to me. That the goal, the game plan is maybe these guys will be off balance. They are hitting a soft fastball. Maybe they're not timing up my slider, my change, or my curve. And then when they can't do that, I can go 5-6 innings and only be at 70, 75 pitches. But last night, Spencer Torkelson gets him twice. Has a 2-run bomb in the first, has a 3-run bomb, I believe, later on in the top of the fourth. And he gives up 5 runs in 5 innings. Not completely ugly. He's had worse starts since coming off his injury. But I thought to myself, is this Daniel Lynch still building off that shoulder injury? Right? If he didn't have the large chunk at the beginning of the season, is it something where we don't see that velocity really kick up until September, just because the season's been a bit unique for him? Or is this a scenario where he's tried to change who he is, pitch more to contact, and sit 90 to 91? That, to me, feels like a number 5 starter. I was talking with one of my good buddies, Joel Penfield, over at KC Sports Network. He also has a great podcast, One Royal Way, with Jordan Foote and Josh Kaiser. So be sure to check them out as well. Joel believes that's just five-man stuff. That's a five-starter in your rotation, throws 89 to 91. No, really just pitching to contact. He's not a big strikeout guy. And maybe that's unfortunate for me because I thought Daniel Lynch had the highest upside. But if he's a number 5 starter and he's pitching to contact, that in no way, shape, or form can be the highest upside of that draft class. That's the big concern, right? And I think last night it worries me that maybe in the end, Daniel Lynch is never going to have that stuff that can translate to the big league level. This is fine for a team that's 40 games under 500, but if the Royals are really going to be serious about contending 2-3 years from now, well, is Daniel Lynch a part of that with this type of stuff? I can't really say that he is. That is a big concern of mine with velocity. We were raving about Alec Marsh and Cole Reagans, and I even gave praise to Brady Singer. All three of those guys have good enough velocity. Daniel Lynch doesn't have this type of velocity, or their type of velocity. Now, Chris Bubich, before he had Tommy John surgery, he had good velocity. He had added a couple miles per hour on his curveball, on his fastball, on his slider. And that was good to see. Daniel Lynch, I think, has regressed a little bit. And they just don't have the flair, the flash, the power behind those pitches anymore. It's more so pitching to contact. And if it works, well, you have to have much better command than he does. And you have to limit the hard contact much better than he really does. But he is the winning pitcher last night, thanks to a great offensive showing from the Royals, who got 11 runs. Dairon Blanco nearly hits for the cycle. Scott Barlow, despite not being a safe situation, he locks it down. And Daniel Lynch does get the win with that big offensive onslaught. That'll do it for another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. Always be sure to follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. And check us out on all the podcasting platforms like Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, and you can always check us out on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that subscribe button. Until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.